The leftists in this country have hollowed out, destroyed, gutted our moral foundation. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll have replaced mom and apple pie. Christians, especially Catholics, have been targeted by the socialist liberals. But Carl Anderson is convinced that all is not lost. He's written a book called Civilization of Love, What Every Catholic Can Do to Change the World. Mr. Anderson, welcome to the Savage Nation.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate the opportunity to have a few words with you.
Well, why did you write this book?
Well, the book, A Civilization of Love, is really an attempt to take seriously some of the teaching of John Paul II and Benedict XVI about how to treat one's neighbor. And so they've been talking about a civilization of love based on the concept of love of neighbor as what ought to really define the basic relationships between people and also define what the relationships ought to be within society. So that's kind of the idea. And what motivated me was reflecting on 9/11. And Knights of Columbus had a lot of members who were tragically killed that day, including a number of firefighters. And we just thought, you know, how do we keep faith with the great sacrifice that these individuals made for our country? And what kind of a country do we want to have going forward? So it ought to be a country that is consistent with their kind of sacrifice. And so we think that civilization of love is the way to go.
It seems to me that most of the country has moved away from the moral foundations we seem to once had.
Well, I had an interesting experience here a few days ago. A former New York City firefighter who was at 9/11, terribly injured that day, told me, "I've read your book. You know, we had in the U.S. a civilization of love for a few days after 9/11. We have to have it again." And I think the kind of courage and dedication and self-sacrifice of men like that are precisely the kind of virtues that the country needs. And this is what the book is about.
You think we can still steer the country back to living with moral values?
I think you teach virtue by living virtue. And so we need people who will step forward and say, I'm going to live this way, I'm going to witness to it, and people are going to see this not in a in-your-face kind of way, but in a subtle, day-to-day, but meaningful way. These are the choices I make, and I make them based on these values. And so I think by witnessing in this kind of a way, we change society, we transform society. And we ought to pay attention to that witness. I mean, one of the things that is so striking to me, look at the values of the men who went into those two buildings and saved so many people on 9/11. And compare that to the kind of value system that's given rise to this huge, terrible financial mess with subprime mortgages and so many of these financial firms writing off billions of dollars. Shouldn't we be able to expect that the guys in the white collars have as much commitment to virtue as the guys in the blue collars that went into those two buildings that day?
Commercialism, entertainment, and the media seems to have played a major role in the loss of these values in America.
Well, certainly communications media and a lot of the entertainment media goes after the dollar, and it certainly brutalizes in a way and takes advantage of a lot of individuals, especially our youth, the kind of messages it sends them. And one of the ways it seems to me we can push back is by having families and individuals really take a stand in their daily lives and say, look, these are the values we're about. They're not these values. And we're going to make an effort to stand for treating people with respect, recognizing human dignity on the part of our neighbors, and having a society that is more caring and respectful of people.
Is living with values going to make dealing with the world's problems like radical Islam any easier?
John Paul II, going back to him for a minute, you know, the Catholic Church talks about being a universal church. John Paul II was really the first pope who was a global pope. He traveled to, 100 times outside of Italy. And, he was looking for a way to connect with people of different cultures, different religions. And what he said was, look, all of us have this deep desire in our heart for love, to find love. And this is the universal value. And regardless of what religion or what tradition we come out of or what country we come out of, we all have families. We all look to provide and protect our children. And we have this in common. And so let's begin there. Let's find a commonality of all the traditions and religions, which he said is love, and people of goodwill can join together to build this kind of a global culture, a global civilization, if you will. So that's a starting point. So people understand we're not looking to hurt them, but we're looking for a common goal of mutual respect and cooperation and tolerance. Now, we also have to be realists and understand that there are evil people in the world that want to hurt other people, and we have a responsibility to protect the innocent from people who would do harm.
Is the new Pope, Pope Benedict, thinking along the same lines?
Well, there's two things that are very interesting about Pope Benedict. People think of him as only being Pope for 3 years. They don't recall that for 25 years he was one of the closest advisors to John Paul II. And so the way that both men view the world, how they cooperated together, there's a strong parallel here. And so John Paul II, Benedict XVI, they're independent and different people, but there's a very clear common vision. And both men have spoken very strongly about this idea of a civilization of love. In fact, I was with Pope Benedict just a few days ago where he spoke again about the necessity of coming together to help people in need, to help people who are suffering, and in doing so, helping to build a civilization of love.
Well, Pope Benedict has already had some problems with the more radical Islamists. Is this going to change how he acts toward other religions?
Well, Pope Benedict, his entire professional life, and we have to remember his vocation is the vocation to the priesthood, but his chosen profession is that of being a scholar and university professor. His training is to speak very clearly and to try to identify points of difference and to understand clearly where the points of difference are as the first step to trying to reach, if not agreement, at least a mutual understanding. And so that's very clearly a part of his effort. Now, some people may see that as not being very diplomatic at times, but that's something which his experience leads him to, and which I think if we really want meaningful agreement, this is the first step. He is not going to back down from threats or from exaggerations of what he says. He's a man of extreme, profound confidence and serenity, and that's a result of his deep spirituality, but it's also a result of his very strong intellectual judgment and study of these issues. And so I think you see that he's not afraid to speak what he thinks to be the truth, and he's not afraid to go places like he did when he visited Turkey amid many threats. So he's a man of courage who I think can, with his approach, do a great deal to further a meaningful dialogue or discussion among the religions of the world.
Carl Anderson, thanks for being on the Savage Nation.
Well, it was great to have this opportunity to speak with you, and I always enjoy listening to you.
Savage.